Welcome back to another one of Nathan Bell's awesome commentary videos. Wherever you are in the world, good morning, good evening, or good night. Today, Nathan's going to talk to us about the release and freedom of Australian whistleblower and journalist Julian Assange.
Well, it's a time to celebrate because Julian Assange has been set free. So this is a great day for journalism. Unfortunately, Julian still had to accept the charges of conspiracy to release secretive information, which sets a precedent that we can punish journalists for disclosing information which is in the public interest. A dangerous precedent has still been set that journalists can be punished for doing what journalists are supposed to do. I've said previously in videos about Julian Assange that Julian Assange is a journalist, and the role of journalists in our society is to scrutinise government and to investigate government and other bodies to ensure that they are behaving with proper conduct and correctly. So journalists are our regulators in society, as I said in a previous video. They are independent actors who investigate authority bodies and other bodies, business bodies, to ensure that they are behaving correctly. And we shouldn't punish journalists for disclosing information that is in the public interest. So despite the fact that Julian has been released, a dangerous precedent has still been set that by his having to accept the charges of conspiracy to release secretive material, that we can't scrutinise the government and we can't investigate the government. So in my view, the power should be in the hands of citizens, and journalists are citizens acting on behalf of the public to scrutinise government and other bodies. So we still sit in this situation where the state, particularly in America, if you're an American citizen, and American affairs affect the global community, we still sit in this position where the state is enforcing their absolute authority over the public and saying that the public cannot scrutinise the state. It's amazing the Americans don't respect Julian Assange's position as a journalist, because the Americans bombard the Chinese government with allegations that China suppresses freedom of press and that the Chinese government holds journalists from the West in prison and detains them on espionage charges. And this is exactly what the Americans have done by charging Julian Assange. They are destroying freedom of press and free media in the Western world, and it's complete hypocrisy when you look at how they criticise the Chinese government and other governments for doing the same thing, which baffles me. That hypocrisy just baffles me, that they can't see that. So Julian has had to accept the charge and plead guilty to conspiracy to declassify secretive material. But whatever happened to saying that the journalist has a moral obligation to declassify, to share information like this? Whatever happened to saying the journalist has evidence that the government has acted in a corrupt way, so they have a moral obligation to release that information? You know, the government of America seems to have forgotten that. They seem to have forgotten that people have a moral obligation to release incriminating material. And it's like any criminal. If you have incriminating material on a murderer or a rapist, or a thief, you have a moral obligation to disclose that information to the authorities and to the public. And that is what journalists do. They have a moral obligation to disclose the incriminating information that they find. A precedent has still been set by Julian having to accept these charges. And it's a dangerous precedent which will destroy free media and journalism in the West. But at least Julian is a free man, free to come home to Australia and live the rest of his life. And at least we won't see Julian rotting in an American cell for the next few decades. We'll see him living a free life now. I wonder whether Julian will return to doing the same sort of behaviours he has done in the past, and whether he will continue leaking classified information, or whether he's had enough of that. I'd say he's probably had enough of that now. He doesn't want to go back to jail and doesn't want to go through that ordeal again. I want to praise the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese for his support of Julian Assange and his lobbying of the American government to free Assange. Clearly, Albanese is an Assange friend, a friend of Assange's, and it's good to have a supportive government who understands that Assange should be a free man. So it's a day to celebrate that Assange is free. And now, I'd like to see Assange return to running WikiLeaks and leak more classified information in the future. But I don't think he's going to do that. I think he's probably had enough of risking his freedom with this experience of being incarcerated for so many years, so he probably won't return to doing that. And it's a shame, because I believe in WikiLeaks and I believe in the cause of WikiLeaks. You know, we have a right as citizens in the free world, in democracy, to act on government and to investigate government and to scrutinise government, and we have an obligation in the free world to regulate our governments and to scrutinise our governments and to investigate our governments. And that's how it should be, in my mind. Citizens in the country, in the West, in democracy, should act on the government, they should scrutinise the government, and they should investigate the government. And when they find incriminating evidence and material that the government has committed crimes, they should release it, and they have a moral obligation to release that information. So, you know, if we see this being the end of WikiLeaks, I'd be disappointed. WikiLeaks is a great pro-democratic company and a great pro-democratic organisation that has done good work in the world. And let's not forget that the heinous murders of civilians that the US military helicopter pilots did, which Julian Assange released, which should have been released, because the public has a right to know that civilians were being killed in Iraq, and all the other evidence of other civilian murders by the US military in Iraq, which should have been released. You know, what are we going to say, that the US military can just go around and kill civilians, and then if anyone catches them out for it and exposes them for it, they get sent to jail? Because that's what's happened. And as I said, Julian has still had to plead guilty to releasing this information, which should have been released and which the public has a right to know, and which it is morally right for this information to be released. So yeah, it's, you know, still the case. It's unfortunate that the US government won't acknowledge that Julian Assange has done the right thing, that he is a righteous man, and that he is a hero who has served democracy and helped democracy by releasing this information. That is certainly my view, and I maintain that view, and I'm sure that's Julian Assange's view as well. Now, whether the release of this information endangered lives in the military, I don't buy that. I don't think it endangered the lives of anyone in the military. And what about the lives lost to the murder of civilians by soldiers in the Iraq War? Now, what about the danger to the civilians in Afghanistan who were murdered by US military pilots and fighters? You know, so, you know, it's this hypocrisy and this silly double standard that the Americans have, and which previous Australian governments have had. But again, praise to Anthony Albanese for supporting Assange and for lobbying for his release, and for pushing for that. So clearly the current Australian government can see sense and understands that Julian Assange is a journalist who acted in the name of democracy and did the right thing. It's just a shame that Julian had to accept those charges, because that sets a dangerous precedent. So it's a week to celebrate. We've won. Julian Assange is free. He's released. He can live the rest of his life a happy man. I'm sure he's very traumatised and shook up, and he needs some time to recover from the ordeal that he's been through. But he's free now, and now he will be able to live his life a free man. So it's a wonderful day for democracy that Julian is free. As I said, just a shame that he had to accept those charges of espionage. He did the right thing. What he did was the right moral thing to do, releasing that information, and that is what our obligation in democracy. If we find evidence that the government has committed crimes, we have a moral obligation to release it, just like if we had evidence of a rapist down the street, or a murderer down the street, or a pedophile down the street, we would have a moral obligation to hand that evidence over to the police and the authorities. That is exactly what Julian did, and he did the right thing. So there's some thoughts about Julian Assange's release. Drop a comment in the comment section about what you think about Julian Assange's release.